Your new film, Duchess, congratulations. It's the first time you've done a crime thriller. So, what drew you to the genre after years of doing horror and sci-fi?
Well, I think that's generally I'm a complete cinephile. I love all movies and all genre movies, particular, and so I've managed to jump around doing all kinds of things with it. Between film and television, I've covered a lot of ground from sci-fi, fantasy, horror. I've done westerns. I've done time travel. I've done all sorts of stuff, and I've always loved the gangster and crime thriller genre as well. Um, Although it's interesting, it never occurred to me when I was making it, but it's like this is the first film I've done that's sort of set in the real world.
Mm.
That don't have any fantasy elements or genre elements beyond the gangster stuff. But um, yeah, it was just it appealed to me. It was when Charlotte and I first came up with the story back in 2018 actually. I think we were eating sushi and talking about gangster movies, and the idea for a sort of female Scarface was knocked around, and it kind of grew from there and evolved into something very different. But trying to combine elements of all the different sort of gangster movies that we love and the styles that I love, in terms of like, I love 70s cinema. So like I kind of lent into that very heavily with this in terms of the style and the music specifically, and the use of captions and titles and even the fonts and things in the titles. So yeah, that was a big inspiration.
Are there any filmmakers or films in particular that you kind of look to for reference?
From like the Italian Job to Goodfellas and Snatch, and so there's a bit of Tarantino, of course. So little bits of all sorts in there.
So, going back to The Descent and throughout your career, you've had a lot of female protagonists at the forefront. Is that something that happens organically?
It became about with The Descent almost as a response to Dog Soldiers, and a lack of that lack of there being any kind of horror films at the time, and not many since that had like an all-female cast. It's still quite rare. Um, and so that kind of led to one thing, and then when I did Doomsday, it was like, okay, like, I really fancied doing a strong female protagonist in that, and then flipped it for Centurion and had a really strong female antagonist in that one. And then of course once Charlotte and I teamed up on projects, we were generating projects specifically with her in mind for the lead. So it always it just naturally formed that way. So I've kind of got a bit of a reputation for doing those kind of things now, but it's fine by me. I really like strong female characters. So
So, how do you view the state of British horror at the moment?
I think British horror needs to do a little bit of catching up right now, because like horror goes in cycles, and I remember that the Descent and everything was part of there was a big resurgence in horror in the early 2000s, and of course we had the advantage of certain companies like Lionsgate or whatever were putting horror movies into the cinemas, and in the UK we had a lot of filmmakers doing horror movies, and people were getting their films seen. And it seems to have kind of gone back underground a little bit, especially in the UK now. There is an inherent attitude in the UK film industry that frowns upon horror. And when somebody, and I think that maybe the only reason in the UK things picked up was because the likes of like Danny Boyle did 28 Days Later, and suddenly it became respectable. It's like, oh, like, a respectable director's doing horror, so okay, we'll accept horror for a few years, and now it's kind of gone back underground again. And because I remember how difficult it was to get Dog Soldiers made back in the day. It was like the attitude from the British film industry was so snobby, about we don't do that kind of thing. Well, we do, and we have a history of it with Hammer and such like. We have an incredible history of it. Fucking Mary Shelley, for God's sake. Read your history books and know your subject. Horror is very much intrinsic to the UK. So for the film industry to be turning their noses up at it because it's the distant cousin of in the movie world, it's just stupid. But because as is proved again and again, every once in a while a horror film comes along that just hits home like Longlegs has in the States, just really lands, or like Smile did, or like, Don't Breathe did, like some great horror films that get a look in and find an audience. And it doesn't seem like there's a huge amount coming out of the UK that's, getting that chance now, be it maybe it's the kind of films that are getting allowed to be made or distribution or whatever it is, but um it shouldn't be just down to Fright Fest, to be the champion of all things horror. Thank God they do, and they're brilliant at it. But it shouldn't just be left to them and a handful of other, passionate festivals throughout the UK. The industry itself needs to get behind it as well.
I think horror as a genre in general deserves kind of respect. So how do you see elevated horror?
I don't think it means anything. I think it's just a buzzword. It's like because A24 is releasing its elevated horror, it's gonna think it's like, oh, now it's worthy. It's like it's just good horror films at the end of the day. It's just there's good horror films, there's bad horror films. Um, you know, but there shouldn't be any snobbery about it because it's all just movies that are hard to make and people go out and graft hard and get them made. So yeah, elevated horror. I don't know. It's like high concept. What that means. I mean, horror in itself is elevated. The whole thing is elevated. That's the whole point of it. So elevating something that's already elevated, I don't know.
Do you still see the cinematic experience, seeing it on a big screen with a good sound system? Is that still in your mind?
Can't help it. Um, I think just from my inspirations onwards, I inherently make anything that I do as cinematic as I possibly can. And I always, when I'm imagining this thing, whatever it may be, I always see it on a big screen. I don't imagine something to be seen in the living room or on somebody's iPhone. I mean, that would just depress the hell out of me.
So you're anti watching things on a small screen then?
Well, I think some things are well suited to watch on a at home. Some things are fine for that. Certain kind of films are shot in such a way that it's like it doesn't really matter what screen they're put on. I'm sometimes amazed that I watch films that I think, oh, there's no cinematic eye gone into this at all. But it works fine. It works fine in the context of whatever. I don't think any movie deserves to be watched on an iPhone. I think that's a crime. But they do, and you can't really stop that. Um, so yeah, I inherently, I shoot things widescreen. I give, I design whole films around the idea of watching it in it with an audience on a big screen. I mean, that's the key for me, and that has always been that love of cinema and being there with the crowd, experience something amazing is unique and should be treasured and will carry on.
And Duchess seems like the kind of film that highly benefits from a shared
Yeah,
audience.
I'm really looking forward to at some point seeing it I've seen it on a couple of like private screenings on relatively big screens, but I'd like to see it in the cinema with a full audience. And seeing it with a bunch of regular punters is like you get a much more honest appraisal of what the film is than you do if you're watching it with, jaded critics or whatever it is that, or fellow filmmakers or whoever it is that's a slightly loaded audience. One thing I have found about it is it's the female audience has responded really strongly to it. So I'm really keen to target and let people know that like women will really enjoy this film. So they should drag along their boyfriends who will also enjoy it.
How do you know when violence is too much? Is there a limit?
One thing I'd say is like I don't think it's ever too much. Like I think and in a weird way, like the more over the top you go, you start getting into it becomes hilarious. Like it becomes over I think that's what Tarantino does so well. Is like it goes so far over the top. It's really funny. Um, but anything that's sexual violence, then yes, there are definitely limits, and I've always avoided that kind of thing in my films because I think that's a serious business and not to be joked about and not to be over the top and become hilarious. That's a totally different thing. But like kind of daft over the top violence, against criminals and stuff like that within the context of this film is like, yeah, go for it. I can't help bringing my horror sensibilities to that kind of stuff. So Um, I could never, I'd struggle to make a film that where I've got to like hold back on these things because it's fun.
It is fun and a lot of practical effects I noticed in the film.
Still try and do as much practically as I can. It's not always easy. It usually comes down to budget and schedule, but I always try. So I still try and use squibs for bullet hits when I can. And I'll always say like I'll give the special effects guys, I'll give you one go at doing it, and if it doesn't work, then we'll have to use CG. But like you'll always get a shot. So it's kind of the ball's in your court, but I want to use those if I can. It's just that sometimes the reset time on those is prohibitive. Of like, okay, you get one shot, but if resetting is going to take 20 minutes, we don't have time. So, I try and be fair about that.
Okay, desert island horror films then. If you had to pick five, if you're feeling generous, horror films, what would you pick?
Um, I mean, I do tend to go for the same ones because they're the ones that help define and shape me. So I'd say American Werewolf in London,
Mhm.
Alien. I'll go for The Omen. I always loved The Omen.
I love The Omen. It was formative for me. I watched it way too young
I
and
saw it when I was like 8 or 9 or something like that, and I'll never forget David Warner's head spinning across the glass. I think there's something weirdly beautiful about it. So I go for that. Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Shining. I saw them all when I was like in my early teens, and that's what shapes your love of movies or whatever for the rest of the time.
absolutely. And that shows in all of your films, up to Duchess, even though it's not a horror film, there's that kind of genre enthusiasm that really comes through.
Oh, love that.
So Duchess is in select cinemas from the 9th of August, and then it's out on digital download from the 12th of August. Thanks very much for talking to us today, Neil.
All right. Cheers.